Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Monday, May the 10th, 2021. I want to start off by talking about journalism and how it's changed. Journalism used to be a male profession, and of course, we all know the cliches: hard-drinking, solitary men, bitter, sarcastic, etc. But journalism has now become a largely female profession. And journalism used to be about the news, but it's no longer about the news. It's now about, let me tell you about my suffering. Oh, yes, and here's a capsule review of the latest Bachelor episode. And did you know that Gossip Girls is being remade? Yeah. Here's an amazing story from studyhall.xyz by Olivia Messer. When I told my editors at the Daily Beast that I needed to quit my job as the newsroom's lead COVID reporter, I couldn't even say the word quit. Even now, weeks later, it feels like admitting failure. I was working in my dream job in a newsroom I loved, where I was writing about what felt like the most important beat in the world. I felt lucky to be employed and alive in the middle of a global pandemic. But in between meetings and interviews and filing stories, I was falling apart. I was writing poems about suicide. I went whole days without eating at all. At one point, I collapsed onto the floor from dehydration. I was vomiting from stress. I developed a sty in my left eye. I wasn't getting out of bed most days. I was crying all the time. My nightmares, in which I was shot or raped or watching coworkers burn alive in front of me, scared me so much that some nights I refused to sleep at all. When I wasn't too afraid to sleep, I was still restless because I was too angry or too anxious or too sad or too filled with shame. I sometimes woke in the early morning hours with bile climbing up my throat and the simmer of heartburn in my chest. There were times I took sick days because I couldn't stop sobbing long enough to string even a few pitches together. I was struggling to stay above water when the footage of the January 6th insurrection triggered the post-traumatic stress disorder I thought I'd shaken years ago. By the time someone I loved died a few weeks later, I was already drowning. You see, women aren't fit for journalism. As they say, no news is bad news, and journalism is about bad news. It's not about all the good things that happened yesterday. It's about all the bad things that happened yesterday. A journalist traditionally reacted to their jobs by a kind of distancing, disassociating themselves, relying on black humor. But no, women are apparently incapable of that. Speaking of disassociating, Olivia writes, I can't remember what sparked it, but one night during dinner with my family, I started disassociating. I was trying to figure out how they were experiencing joy, whether it was even real, what a smile looks like, and how I could emulate it. Soon afterward, I started thinking through the financial realities of quitting. I was finally numb enough to care more about curbing the onslaught of new physiological and mental fire alarms going off in my body than my fear of failure. When I announced my decision on February the 8th, I just barely mustered the courage to be honest about it. While I'm tempted to be vague about my departure, I also believe it's important to acknowledge the profound exhaustion, loss, grief, burnout, and trauma of the past year covering and living in a mass casualty event that has changed all of our lives, I tweeted at the time. For now, I must take a break. I know exactly how rare it is to have a support system and circumstance that enables me to acknowledge and then act on that fact. Golly, one can only imagine how, say, reporters covering the First or Second World War managed to get through the trauma. But then again, they were men, weren't they? Olivia continues, it had been clear for months that many of us were struggling. Still, the isolation of the pandemic had me convinced that my experience of drowning was unique and that maybe I just couldn't handle a hard job. Rare truth there. But in response to those tweets, a chorus of reporters and editors in public, via Twitter DM and by email, chimed in to offer solidarity and to say they felt the same way. I heard the same things from TV, newspaper, and digital journalists in Austin and New York at outlets ranging from conservative leaning to mainstream to liberal. I've since interviewed a dozen local and national journalists. Many of them told me they do not feel supported by newsroom leaders, that they do not have the tools they need to handle the trauma they are absorbing, and that most of their bosses don't seem to care about how bad it has gotten. Some said they are still finding themselves sobbing after meetings, between meetings, on calls during work, or when the day ends. If you are a reporter, that is to say, you were taking other people's grief and mining it for headlines, if you find yourself sobbing, you are obviously in the wrong profession. Much has been written about burnout among healthcare workers and teachers and lawyers, and about how the mental health crisis has created a parallel pandemic of PTSD and anxiety and depression. Despite the spate of headline-worthy media departures, the industry has failed to examine how and why COVID reporters in particular are struggling so much, or what can be done about it. 6 weeks after I announced my resignation, Stacey Marie Ishmael stepped down from her job as editorial director for the Texas Tribune, citing the relentless and breakneck pace at which she had been working for the past year. "I totally burned out," she said. At the same time, Millie Tran, the Tribune's chief product officer, announced that she too was longing to take a break. All women. It's been impossible for me to separate what's been happening in the world, which we've been covering rigorously and intensely for these 12 months, from what's happening in my own life and in the lives of my friends, families, and communities, Ishmael wrote to the Tribune's staff. A few days later, my friend Stephen Paulson announced that he was leaving his job at the Big Bend Sentinel in Marfa, Texas, to take time off, citing a year of COVID reporting work that felt like running a marathon. 2 weeks later, Megan Greenwell, editor of Wired, tweeted that like Tran and Ishmael, she was stepping down after realizing she was totally drained. Susie Banikarim, formerly executive vice president, head of global news gathering at Vice, said she left her position in January because she was fried after a relentless year in which she lost the ability to disconnect from work. That's what the alcohol is for, Susie. No amount of Peloton or meditation was helping. Nice Peloton reference. Some in the industry left their jobs more quietly. One former pandemic reporter told me she quit writing about the coronavirus because doing it for a year ruined me. A former political reporter at a major cable news network who covered the congressional response to COVID told me she left her job after 8 months of being exhausted and hating my job and wanting to quit journalism entirely. It was worsened by the death of a loved one to the coronavirus, and it took months before she started feeling like herself again, she said. And it goes on and on and on and on. Let me tell you about my pain. Covering COVID-19 is trauma reporting. Is that any different about filing a story about a fire in an apartment building, in which 6 people, including 4 children, get killed? Is it really much different than that? Again, no news is good news. Oh, she informs us a phenomenally informative Harvard Business Review story about burnout from March reported that there are 6 main causes: unsustainable workload, perceived lack of control, insufficient rewards for effort. Oh, I see. Your paycheck isn't enough, and seeing your byline in the newspaper isn't enough. Lack of a supportive community, lack of fairness, and mismatched values and skills. The article, written by Jennifer Moss, another woman, points out that companies often suggest that they're exhausted, and grieving employees try tactics to manage the consequences of burnout, like yoga and meditation, when workplaces need higher level interventions. It's an organizational problem that requires an organizational solution, Moss wrote. I'm still recovering, Olivia concludes, and I've got a lot more work to do. But one day, without even thinking about it, amid the exposure therapy sessions and watercolors paintings and conversations with supportive peers and nights spent cooking dinner for my parents, I started smiling again. That has to count for something. Yes, I suppose it does, Olivia. And here is another example of me reporting from old standby Rosie DeMano in the Toronto Star on Saturday. The renewal credit card arrived in the mail. I activated it over the phone, and following recorded instructions, I destroyed the expired one. Just as the scissors snipped it in half, I realized it was the new card. Oh, crap. Was that a pre-senior moment, sheer stupidity, or COVID brain fog? That's the bitch of the thing. One can never be certain. Brain fog isn't a medical diagnosis. It's a general term used to describe the feeling of being mentally slow, fuzzy, confused, or spaced out, or, I don't know, being a woman. Lingering brain fog is a neurological symptom that people with COVID-19 commonly report. It can last for many, many months after recovery from coronavirus infection. Rosie confides to us, I contracted COVID a year ago. Don't know how, don't know where, possibly in Florida at spring training. More likely, I suspect, in the arrivals hall at Toronto Pearson, jammed with returning travelers, stuck for 2 hours in sluggishly moving queues, the airport in a state of utter chaos at the dawn of the pandemic. Nobody was wearing a mask. Nobody had yet been told to wear a mask. Frankly, nobody, including health authorities, knew what they were doing. The messaging was frequently wrong. Knocked off my feet for 3 weeks, most of which coincided with the compulsory quarantine period after foreign travel. Sick as a dog, raging fever that wouldn't break, joint pain, aching all over, pounding headaches, so weak I had to crawl to the bathroom. Worst of all, I felt like I was drowning in my own lungs, a massive weight on my chest. Symptoms severe enough that I ended up in the ER at St. Mike's. Blessedly, I wasn't admitted because really, last place you want to be during a pandemic is the hospital, unless you need oxygen or more complicated treatment. Instead, I ordered a bed wedge, a piece of foam that goes on the mattress, elevating the torso. It eased my breathing struggles. Now, semi-vaccinated, I have no qualms about returning to Buffalo when the Jays move north in a few weeks, and no anxiety about covering the Tokyo Olympics in July. Loath as I am to write first-person columns, I asked for reader indulgence this one time because I am every person who has recovered from COVID coming through the fire relatively unscathed, except for long-haul COVID, aka post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2 infection, or PASC, as designated by the National Institutes of Health in the US. Ah, I see. We have a new replacement for that made-up disease, chronic fatigue syndrome. It's called long-term COVID. And it seems to be overwhelmingly women who suffer from this. She concludes, Canada this week became the first country to approve the use of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine in children aged 12 to 15. But younger children contract COVID also, and even if asymptomatic, can infect older family relatives while vaccination is being ramped up. Presida has a 3-year-old who will be starting preschool in September. That's the nightmare scenario I'm worried about. Kids aren't vaccinated. There's probably not going to be a vaccine approved for them until late fall. They start spreading it to each other because we haven't invested things like improving the ventilation or getting them to wear masks or having lunch outdoors. Average age of COVID death, 81. 10 to 15% of kids get long COVID. Can you imagine? We're already condemning a lot of our children to potentially a lifetime of problems. I could go on, but really, I have to lie down. Our brave, so brave reporters. Let's look at the chat here. Hello to random number. Dan, Popcasso 88. John S., who says acid reflux is a bitch. Yo Mama says journalists also drank KMG. Yes, I know. Hello to Walrus Libertarian, who says navel gazing to the 10th degree. Dan Allison says, my favorite fictional reporter was Darren McGavin as Carl Kolchak, working class guy digging for truth. Hello to Billy Smith, who says, hello, Kevin, and thank you for introducing me to Yacht Rock on Friday. I checked out the episodes on YouTube and haven't laughed so hard in months. That Van Halen episode was insanely hilarious. Hello to Ann Run, who says, I tried to find the one KMG mentioned in which the Steely Dan guys get bullied, but couldn't find it. Is it just called Yacht Rock? Yeah, I just, they're short episodes. They're about 10 minutes long. Just watch them all in a row. It's worth it. G.C. Stahl says, hello, KMG. These reporters should become teachers. A lot of time off between Zoom meetings. Roulette Crack says, who'd have thought anti-human lying propagandists can end up feeling self-disgust and repulsed by their own reflection? Random Number says, I always hate when news people try to find inspiring and uplifting stories. Hello to Tom Anderson. Hauper says, the Ernie Pyle Award for Valor in Journalism goes to... DeBrea says, not looking at her at the gym is toxic masculinity, I am told. Who saw the KMG drunk tweet bingo on Twitter? I saw it. It's disconcerting to see oneself as others see you, but it is accurate enough, There was no Kubrick square, says Hauper. Indeed. GC Style says, my nightmare scenario is Ontario extending the lockdowns. Hello to Star Rover. Cobbett has shown that no woman or effeminate male should be in a political position of authority. Anne Run says, yeah, I don't recall one. I think there could have also been a square for Kevin calling someone something his favorite or his hero. Popcasso 88 says, I'm listening to KMG on my portable radio. Let's talk more about journalism and how journalists, who used to be famed as skeptics, as sarcastic bastards, are now teachers' pets, snitches. Rosa Luxemburg, I would guess that's a nom de plume, writes on VDare, leftist enforcer Jared Holt likes to ruin people's lives. He takes pride in deplatforming patriots from social media and payment processors, and of course enjoys watching them lose their livelihoods. Yet the patriots that Holt has made a career of attacking have done little to publicize his own past or activities, i.e., his close ties to Antifa and other advocates of terrorist violence, or his sly suggestions that police and conservative women deserve to be harmed. Now it's time to dox another doxer. Holt has a long past of inflammatory, inappropriate commentary on social media. During high school, he instructed high school girls not to look like an easy freshman whore. Others, who called themselves freshies, he wrote, sound like a queer. Oh, dear. Holt got his start in Washington, D.C. politics working at Media Matters, the nonprofit that monitors conservative media. Holt then built his resume at Right Wing Watch, a project for the people for the American way. While there, he spread the media smear, which ended in court settlements, that Nicholas Sandman and the Covington Catholic High School kids were racists for defending themselves against the racial insults of the Black Hebrew Israelites and an Indian fake war hero at the March for Life. Now Holt is grazing on greener and better funded pastures, the Atlantic Council. Like most other think tanks, it boasts of a lofty mission. The Atlantic Council promotes constructive leadership and engagement in international affairs based on the Atlantic community's central role in meeting global challenges. In other words, it's another one of the ubiquitous leftist foundations that provide employment for the otherwise unemployable. Instead of writing 250-word hit pieces about conservatives, Holt's new position confers the prestige of being an extremism expert. Holt, of course, has no expertise in anything except character assassination. But that aside, at least he needn't work all that hard. A search of the site returns just 2 reports, both done with others. It's a nice, cushy job, if you can get it, at a nice, cushy, prominent think tank. In fiscal 2018, the most recent year for which there are tax forms available, The Atlantic Council brought in $30 million in contributions and grants. People for the American Way brought in a piddling $7 million. Clearly, Holt has moved up in the world. The Atlantic Council is the ultimate deep state Death Star. Contributions of $1 million or more came from Facebook, Goldman Sachs, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Embassy of the United Arab Emirates. Other big names include these blue chip companies: AT&T, Dell, Microsoft, Hulu, Google, Twitter, 20th Century Fox, BP, Chevron, and ExxonMobil, Boeing, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Lowe's, FedEx, Nestle, Procter & Gamble, Washington Redskins. Oh, they're not called that, aren't they, anymore? And the Bank of America and the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Of course, it also takes money from taxpayers around the globe in the form of subsidies from the U.S., British, French, German, Japanese, Finnish, Lithuanian, and Bahraini governments. The European Union is also a contributor. Subsidies from American taxpayers come from the Departments of Defense and Energy, the U.S. Marine Corps, and the U.S. mission to NATO. As reported earlier, Holt's family is wealthy and well-connected, nor is he alone in his world-shaking endeavors. His fiancée is Andrea Schultz, otherwise known as Dre Schultz on social media. Her LinkedIn page advertises her as a grants specialist in the Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance at the U.S. Agency for International Development, which means she helps distribute foreign aid. So while Holt's Atlantic Council receives money from the U.S. government and foreign governments to talk about so-called right-wing extremism, his fiancée helps make the U.S. government's decisions on disaster assistance. No conflict of interest there. Last year, by the way, Holt wrote about the ouster of White House USAID liaison Merritt Corrigan, something of an interesting hit piece given his fiancée Schultz's job at the agency. That said, a straight-laced, wing-tipped outfit like the Atlantic Council and the governments and corporations funding it should not be too happy their money is funding an extremist researcher and professional doxer who, as his record shows, practically embedded with Antifa. USAID, which appears to shy from controversy, should not be too happy that one of its employees is intimately involved with an apologist for far-left extremism and terror. Consider a few highlights from Holt's career as a doxer and podcast host. In 2019, Holt fanboy Connor Betts killed 9 people and injured 17 others in Dayton, Ohio. Screenshots and media reports showed that Betts regularly interacted with Holt's content online. Once Holt found out that Betts interacted with him, Holt blocked the killer. Guilt by association? Maybe, but that's Holt's stock in trade. Does the Atlantic Council know about the Betts-Holt connection? Here's something the Atlantic Council and his fiancée might like to know. On his podcast, Holt told his listeners where to find a political enemy's phone number and suggested they should sexually harass him by sending him photos of their penises, otherwise known as dick pics. For some reason, Joey Saladino, aka Joey Salads, he posted his phone number on Twitter, said the man who polices the right for extremism. For whatever reason, the guy's attention hungry, and I'm sure getting blown up with text messages was just the type of thing to get him off that day. And now apparently he's complaining that people are sending him dick pics. With a wink and a nod, the Atlantic Council's resident fellow offered this advice. So I'm going to join in the chorus of Splinter and say that you should absolutely not send dick pics to a phone number that reads, actually, you know what, bleep that out. I don't want to get accused of harassment. Let's not do that this time. But yeah, there is an article on Splinter that does have these tweets embedded, which are still live for some reason. But yeah, do not send Joey Salads your dick pics. Disavow. We do not endorse. Holt has winked at violence against political opponents, police officers, and of course, women, something else his betrothed might like to know. Discussing the dangerous leftist tactic of milkshaking, or throwing milkshakes often mixed with concrete at political opponents, Holt said, I mean, it's just funny to laugh at, but it really is kind of emblematic of just how ridiculous things have become. On another episode of his podcast, Holt and his guest Matt Binder laughed at a first-hand official account of Antifa throwing bricks, bottles, and cans and other projectiles at the Portland Police Department. After journalist Andy Ngo was milkshaked and given a brain hemorrhage, Holt appeared on Binder's podcast Doomed and said Ngo had the goal of further antagonizing people and said he was merely hit around a little bit. As for his opinion of what should happen to conservative women, Holt said this about Fox commentator Tomi Lahren. Cardi B made this Instagram video where she's talking about the government shutdown. And then when Tomi Lahren, or Tamara Laundry, or whatever the F you want to call her, tweeted that Cardi was, she's saying this sarcastically, the latest genius political mind to endorse the Democrats. Cardi responded, "Leave me alone, I will dog walk you," which is slang for just like basically beating the shit out of somebody. It effing rules, man. I'd love to see. Yes, sneaks, snitches, teachers' pets. This is the state of journalism today. Oh, but it gets even worse. According to Bruce Campion-Smith in the Toronto Star, 2020 was a bad year for journalists. They were assaulted, imprisoned, and even murdered for their reporting. Yes, journalism can be a dangerous profession. But no, let's get to the worst of it. Online harassment of journalists, notably women and people of color, is a serious problem. The pandemic has heightened that abuse. Reporting on the science of COVID-19, public health restrictions, vaccine rollouts, and debunking false claims have made journalists the target of virulent harassment. Social media providers like Twitter need to do more to protect journalists. All this is happening in an environment where journalists have been derided as the enemy of the people, where fake news has become an epithet, and where false information is easily spread. False information, eh? How about Iraq has weapons of mass destruction? Practically the entire journalism community bought into that obvious howler. And I don't recall many apologies for them. Monday is a day to reflect on that and remember that journalism and trusted information needs its defenders. Yes, let's say you're a COVID-19 skeptic and you're not too keen about experimental vaccines. Well, what does that mean? It means you're a Nazi. Calgary Mayor Naheed Nenshi. Now, I have to say this about Calgary. Alberta is supposed to be Canada's tough guy province, and Calgary is supposed to be Canada's tough guy city. But if that were ever true, it was true a long time ago, because Calgary has been a metrosexual mecca for decades now. Naheed Nenshi, Ugandan Asian gift to Canada, who is a giggling buffoon, but he just kept being re-elected mayor of Calgary. But he says that some recent rallies billed as opposing the wearing of masks during the pandemic are really just thinly veiled white nationalist and anti-government activities. In an interview with the West Block guest host Abigail Bimman, Nenshi expressed his frustration with the fact that people are refusing to wear masks and gathering in large crowds and endangering others. Those people of those anti-masks protests, let's not kid ourselves. They're not people who are protesting because they need to eat. They're people who are marching in thinly veiled white nationalist, supremacist, anti-government protests. He was asked specifically about comments he made during the 2013 Southern Alberta floods, in which he said he was not allowed to use the words he wanted to describe people out canoeing on the volatile and flooded Bow River, and that he had been told he could not invoke the Darwin Law. Here's the problem, is that these folks are not just flagrantly putting themselves at risk, they're putting others at risk. The people on the river during the flood, well, if they drowned, they drowned. But these people are not only putting other people at risk of infection, they're ones who are running the risk of filling up our hospital beds, filling out our healthcare system, despite the fact that they did this to themselves. I'm thinking about the AIDS epidemic of the 1980s. Were the people who got AIDS from homosexual sex or IV drug use, were they responsible for their own illness? That was considered wicked to say such a thing at the time. Nenshi pointed specifically to people coughing and hacking and saying they have bronchitis. We're not that stupid, he said. What on earth is he talking about? Alberta is currently grappling with one of the worst third waves in the country. Yes, 2,100 people have died in Alberta over 14 months in a province of 4.4 million people. Ooh, a devastating epidemic. Infection rates have soared in recent weeks as the province races to roll out available doses of vaccines to the population and as public health officials urge people to hold on for a little while longer. New restrictions went into effect last week in an effort to slow the spread of the virus. Restaurants and bars closed to in-person dining. Outdoor gatherings are capped at 5 people. Salons are closed for 3 weeks, and religious indoor services are capped at 15% capacity. We don't know yet if we've hit the peak of new cases, says Dr. Dina Hinshaw, the province's chief latrine walla. Our provincial R value of 1.12 last week tells us cases are continuing to grow. That's why implementing these measures now is so critical. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said on Friday that the federal government is ready to assist in any way possible if requested to do so by Premier Jason Kenney, and that the two spoke by phone last week. Nenshi said he spoke with Trudeau last week as well. I think we're under control, Nenshi said, but added he thinks the focus increasingly needs to shift to how to get more vaccines, to how best to get them into people's arms as quickly as possible. When I hear stories of people waiting 2 or 3 hours at our vaccine clinic in downtown Calgary, I think we can be more efficient. So I did ask if there were any resources the federal government could help us with the actual putting it into people's arms side. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, the mayor of Calgary. The aforementioned Jason Kenney tweeted on May the 8th, "Today is an important commemoration of one of the greatest victories in the history of human freedom, the day when Canadian troops in Europe joined their allies in celebrating total victory and the complete surrender of the Nazi German regime." Would that be the same Jason Kenney whose health bureaucrat goons arrested a preacher for holding a church service? Why, yes, it did. Jason Kenney's self-awareness level undetectable. This is from Newsweek. Artur Pawlowski, a pastor from Alberta, was arrested Saturday for allegedly organizing a church service that ignored social distancing rules and where congregants were not wearing masks amid the COVID-19 pandemic, marking his latest confrontation with law enforcement following an April incident in which he described local police as Nazis. Prior to the incident, according to Calgary Police, Alberta Health Services got a Court of Queen's Bench order that applies to gatherings, including protests, demonstrations, and rallies. This order imposes new restrictions on organizers of protests and demonstrations requiring compliance with public health orders, including masking, physical distancing, and attendance limits. Pawlowski was arrested alongside his brother David for violating that order. Calgary Police said it issued a statement Saturday that described the arrests, saying the service organizer acknowledged the injunction but chose to ignore requirements for social distancing, mask wearing, and reduced capacity limits for attendees, and continued the event. As a result of the Saturday service continuing, Artur Pawlowski and David Pawlowski have both been arrested and charged with organizing an illegal in-person gathering. Yes, that's what a church service is in the province of Alberta now, an illegal in-person gathering, including requesting, inciting, and or inviting others to attend an illegal public gathering, promoting and attending an illegal public gathering, Calgary Police said in the statement. The police also said it did not enter the church during the service and that the order was issued prior to the gathering. Canadian authorities have reiterated, or repeated, as others might say, their support for faith-based gatherings. Oh, I love that, don't you? Faith-based gatherings across the country, but Calgary Police noted we find ourselves in the midst of a global pandemic and we must comply with public health orders. Yes, we were only following orders. Where have we heard that before? I don't care what you have to say, out, Pawlowski can be heard saying at the time. Out of this property, you Nazis, out. Gestapo is not allowed here. Do not come back, you Nazi psychopaths. Unbelievable, sick, evil people, intimidating people in the church during the Passover, you Gestapo, Nazi, communist, fascists. Christian leaders across the province and Canada expressed varying levels of criticism and support for Pawlowski in the wake of Saturday's protest and ensuing arrest. Nope. He wasn't arrested for holding a church service. Hundreds of pastors are holding services today and still abiding by a law designed to protect people from a deadly virus. He could too. He chooses himself over his neighbor. Church finance over church witness, tweeted Toronto Anglican priest Daniel Brereton. And if you go to Daniel Brereton's Twitter account, you will find out that he has a rainbow flag and he has pronouns and he identifies himself as gay and name checks his gay husband. That's what the Anglican and United Churches in Canada are pretty much just gay covens at this point. Ontario-based pastor Henry Hildebrandt tweeted Saturday in support of Pawlowski and the protesters. Earlier this afternoon, my fellow pastor Artur Pawlowski was arrested in Calgary for the crime of holding a church service, as he does every Saturday morning. Are you awake yet? Hashtag stand with God, hashtag free Pastor Artur. Yes, I imagine must be heady days for Anglican priests, United Church priests, even Catholic church priests. They're paid and they don't have to do anything except hold a Zoom meeting once a week. Nice work, if you can get it. Gamion says, didn't Biden have an interview with Cardi B? Well, nothing would surprise me. Chogokin666 says, I listened to that brave CIA Latinx ad. Oh my God, it is absurd. DeBarea says, I see millions with their immune system turned into Greek salad by Fauci's vaccines. Again, from DeBarea, anything can kill you if you are near death. And again, same source. Yeah, right. Arrest the pastors and let free the criminals. They freed the criminals in Alberta for social distancing. Now they arrested the pastors. What else do we have here? From YH, science is PR, journalism and news is PR, movies are PR, anything that is published is PR. YH again, watching the news is no different than watching an infomercial. Modern journalist equals stenographer, says Palcasso88. Yeah, essentially what they do now is lightly rewrite government press releases. I remember when I was a journalist, this was drilled into me right from the very beginning that you must present both sides of the story. It's now routine, especially in Canadian journalism, where you see a story, okay, here's a guy from the left, here's another guy from the left, here's another guy from the left. Couldn't you find someone who suggests that maybe this is not a good idea? No? You can't? Well, again, I'm tempted to say if you can't, then you are in the wrong profession. Here's a piece in the Calgary Herald from Aretha Van Herk, who makes her living basically telling the world what hicks Albertans are. A Western farmer comes home one afternoon to discover that a hailstorm has destroyed his crop. His farmhouse has been struck by lightning. His wife has run off with his brand new truck, and his dog has had a close encounter with a skunk. He shakes his fist at the sky and shouts, "God damn the CPR." Aside from what that old joke might imply about the Canadian Pacific Railway, and certainly not to target agriculturalists, it reflects a trait fueling Alberta polarization, the blame game. Instead of taking personal responsibility, the now common reaction of many is to locate a person or entity or political party to blame and then yell, demonize, and disobey as if posturing will relieve the situation at hand. The effect is to escalate disaffection and goad extreme ideological valences. Ooh. Yes, and Aretha Van Herk is not in the business of demonizing anyone, except for those idiots who disagree with her about COVID-19. She continues, although such polarization is not more terrifying than COVID, once again, average age of death from COVID in the province of Alberta, 81. It merits inspection and consideration. Increasingly difficult to resist are sweeping generalizations or totalizing comparisons. Again, projection.txt. The temptation to characterize Alberta on the basis of its leanings has infected not only this province, but our reputation and our future, which is dependent on global interrelationality. Global interrelationality. This is a professional writer. Tinfoil hat craziness is not Alberta's dominant trait, but we are being watched and judged by the rest of the world. Oh, boo-hoo. From those who take science seriously to those who buy our resources and those who evaluate our credit rating. Is she seriously suggesting that Alberta's credit rating is going to be downgraded because there are some people who refuse to wear face diapers? Whose fault is it? Asks the wrong question. It's said that a moderate Albertan is an oxymoron, and Albertans are a disobedient lot. At least that's what it looks like from the outside, with rogue rodeos, patio proliferation, and mask malfeasance. Again, this is a professional writer. Is the mutinous Albertan mutinous? Again, people who refuse to wear face diapers outside are guilty of mutiny. Is this a premise that we need to reject, our new passphrase? Better to say that we are disputatious, stubborn, and over certain of the direction we think is best, even when the GPS suggests another route to enable us to avoid heading straight to hell in a handbasket. Not a charming trait and not one to be proud of. Is defiance embedded in Alberta's history, part of our current DNA? Surely pugnacity carried people through subsequent waves of wealth and depression, moments when we needed to survive getting hailed out, flooded out, burned out, or eaten by grasshoppers, riding the boom and bust bronc until we bite the dust, which is, as any rodeo rider knows, inevitable. Are Albertan subscribers to democracy and the rule of law? Or have they signed up for some metaphorical Wild West and the Deadwood motto of no law at all? We are not South Dakota in 1876, but this is 21, and Alberta claims to be cosmopolitan, socially aware, and innovative. Really? It claims to be innovative? So what are the factors behind some Albertans' lack of compliance? Is the debate about restrictions key, or are they deflections, pawns in an extended political game of prisoner's base? Ignorance feeds on blame, finger-pointing, fear-mongering, and bad behavior. And of course, the people who fostered the COVID-19 hysteria can in no way said to have fomented blame, finger-pointing, fear-mongering, and bad behavior. Step back and examine the history that might suggest where our headstrong recalcitrance originates. Indigenous people for centuries figured out to thrive in a challenging landscape and climate and continue to teach us about resilience. No, they don't. Ranchers and settler colonists came to this part of the West packing both optimism and foolhardiness. And while some got discouraged and left, those who stayed subscribed to an obdurate form of survival that, although admirable, is not always ideal. This woman, her parents were Dutch, and they came to Canada after World War II. Aretha Van Herk was born and bred in Alberta, but you can see that she clearly detests her province. Alberta's history is a mixture of intolerance and tolerance, empathy and sectarianism. This woman has no idea what the word empathy means. At the turn of the 20th century, Alberta opened up to a wild proliferation of religions that fed a fundamentalist version of Alberta as a Christian utopia. Such old patterns persist despite contemporary times, much as they are at odds with actual practice. And it goes on. I'll tell you something about Alberta. More than half of the people who live there weren't born in the province. You hear talk about Alberta being conservative. Albertans, like my own people, British Columbians, are rootless, and rootless people cannot be conservative by definition. And as long as we're talking about the blame game, let's have a Jug Meat Sing lay it on for us. This is from Stephanie Taylor at the Canadian Press. Online conspiracy theories about COVID-19 and protests against public health orders are helping to spread dangerous ideas laden with racism and bigotry, says a network monitoring hate groups in Canada. The executive director of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network said since last year, people espousing hateful beliefs have linked themselves to conspiracy and anti-lockdown movements around the novel coronavirus. We have two pandemics. We have the actual pandemic, and then we have the pandemic of hate, Evan Balgord said. Things are kind of getting worse, both online and offline, with maybe one pandemic we have kind of a solution for, but the hate thing, we don't have a vaccine for that. Federal New Democratic Party leader Jagmeet Singh was the latest on Monday to note a connection between anti-mask and anti-lockdown protests and far-right extremism. His comments came as rallies against COVID-19 health orders are being staged across the country, while many provincial doctors battle a deadly third wave of the pandemic. To brazenly not follow public health guidelines put people at risk, and that is something we've seen with extreme right-wing ideology, he told reporters. These demonstrations have been met with frustration for some in the public over what they say appears to be a lack of police enforcement, and a few premiers have promised stiffer fines for COVID-19 rule breakers. The far right has become adept at integrating populist grievances into its own narratives and exploiting them to enhance membership, said Barbara Perry, director of the Center on Hate, Bias, and Extremism at Ontario Tech University in a recent interview. As a result, members of the far right have turned up at virtually all of the recent anti-lockdown gatherings, trying to lend their support to that movement and thereby garner support and sympathy or solidarity with their more extreme movement, she said. Balgord said such events make for fertile hunting for new recruits because hateful ideas are not being policed. Oh dear. And once someone believes in one conspiracy theory, it's easy to believe in others. We now have a greatly increased number of people who are coming into close contact with racists and bigots of all stripes with more conspiracy theories. After and more than a year into the pandemic, Balgord said organizers behind anti-lockdown protests in Vancouver, Toronto, and the Prairies know figures from the country's racist right are involved in their movement. More recently, he said, some protesters have started showing up with Nazi imagery to depict themselves as being persecuted by the government. The racist right that we monitor and the COVID conspiracy movement are inseparable from each other at this point. We monitor them as if they are the same thing because they involve all the same people, said Balgord. He said the network's information is based on what it observes and the far-right figures it follows, but there is a lack of data tracking how conspiratorial thinking around COVID-19 has moved across Canada. After Singh's comments, Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet played down the idea of a connection between the protests and far-right extremism, saying arguments suggesting a correlation were politically motivated. I am absolutely certain that people which have been involved in such discussions in the last hours and days know very well there could be no link between two things that should not be what they are, but are not related. The NDP leader said he sees a link between those refusing to follow public health advice. Oh, if it's just advice, why is compliance demanded? A link between those refusing to follow public health advice and the ideologies of the extreme right, because both show a disregard for the well-being of others and put people at risk. There is a connection, certainly. Singh said declining to listen to COVID-19 health orders is dangerous and needs to be called out. Remember when we were told that the vaccine was going to be our savior? Apparently not. Apparently not. This is from Christopher Reynolds at the Canadian Press. Canada's chief public health officer reminded Canadians on Saturday that even those who are fully vaccinated remain susceptible to COVID-19. Well, then I guess the vaccines don't work then. Is that what she's saying? Speaking at a virtual town hall for Yukoners, Dr. Teresa Tam said the risk of asymptomatic infection and transmission is far lower for anyone who receives 2 shots of the Pfizer-BioNTech, Moderna, or Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccines. But it's not absolute. There's reduction in your risk of transmission, but it doesn't necessarily eliminate your risk of transmission, Tam said. Some studies have shown that it reduces the amount of virus in the back of your nose. If you sample people, there's less virus, which means less risk of transmission. Young people who often work in frontline or essential services and sit at the bottom of vaccination priority queues now have some of the highest case rates and can transmit the virus despite showing no symptoms, Tam added. Yes, and how many of these young people who have contracted COVID-19 have actually died? How many of them have even been hospitalized? The groups that transmit the virus the most are actually younger adults, many of whom have to work. They can't stay at home, Tam said. It's important that we protect them, as well as the fact that if they're protected, we reduce transmission of the virus in the community. And let's see. Oh, yes. And the me file, this is from the Los Angeles Times on Saturday. Fat shaming, BMI, and alienation. COVID-19 brought new stigma to large-sized people. Yes, the news just gets worse and worse. Crystal Bugan cried after the needle went into her arm, not because her first dose of the Moderna vaccine hurt, but because finally being fat actually paid off. The 53-year-old was inoculated in the parking lot of Kaiser Permanente in San Jose on a rainy Friday in March, 4 days after eligibility in California was broadened to include people with underlying conditions, among them a body mass index of 40 or more, 233 pounds for an adult who is 5'4" tall. Bugan's medical record at Kaiser shows she is morbidly obese. As an activist, she prefers the word fat. Her experience with medical providers has been one incident of size stigma after another, she said, like the time she went in with a scratched cornea and was told to lose weight. She fears being hospitalized with COVID-19 and unable to advocate for herself. For that reason, I decided, you know what, I'm not going to feel guilty about being vaccinated. I'm going to do it. And I'm not going to apologize for it. Who's asking you to apologize? I'm going to do it. I've been in fear the whole flipping time, staying home, avoiding everybody. I couldn't do my job. I'm an electrologist. I remove facial hair. I couldn't come to work. I couldn't make money. That, however, is changing thanks to a vial of vaccine, a very sharp needle, and a policy switch that allowed women and men like Bugan a chance to be inoculated before the general public. In California, about a month early. It's not every day that we get something for free because we're fat, said Bugan, who launched a YouTube channel called Fat Product Review. The virus has underscored yet another serious inequity. Studies link higher body mass index, or BMI, with increased risk for severe COVID-19, including higher rates of hospitalization. Other research shows weight bias can keep larger-bodied people from seeking and receiving medical care. At the same time, the pandemic has highlighted a clash between the medical establishment and the fat acceptance movement, between those who use clinical terms such as obesity and overweight, and those who proudly describe themselves as large-bodied, people of size, fat, and even super fat. And there's a picture of Bugan here holding a curvy girl pendant. In 2013, the American Medical Association recognized obesity as a disease. The fat acceptance movement argues it is possible to be healthy at any size. The debate is playing out in doctors' offices and hospital emergency rooms with renewed intensity and raising a complicated question. With more than 70% of adults in the United States either overweight or obese, according to the Centers for Disease Control, who are we first, people or patients? Weight stigma by healthcare providers has been documented for decades. In 1969, researchers found that physicians had negative views of people with obesity and that they preferred not to treat them. A 1982 survey of doctors found that the only people held in lower esteem than those with high BMI were people with drug addiction, alcoholism, and mental illness. Not much has improved. In a 2020 article in the journal Metabolism Clinical and Experimental, the authors noted that weight bias is still widespread among healthcare providers, and that the higher a person's BMI, the more negatively that person will be viewed. Oh, who is this? Tigress Osborne. The picture of this woman. She became head of the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance in January as she was recovering from COVID-19. Tell me, she said, about when you first became aware of coronavirus and when you started thinking about it, what it meant to you as a fat person. Osborne is just the second Black person to head NAAFA in the group's 50-year history. Yes, there's an organization that you've never heard of before, but it's had 2 Black leaders now. How very progressive. Osborne said NAAFA has been predominantly white, but also predominantly interested in treating fatness with sort of a white neutrality. The organization ignored questions of race and ethnicity, even though a high BMI is more prevalent in Black and Latino communities, according to the CDC. I started to think almost immediately about what it would look like for me as a fat Black person, said panelist Deshaun L. Harrison, whose exploration of race and weight, the belly of the beast, the politics of anti-fatness as anti-Blackness, will be published in August. Intersectionality. Don't you just love it? And a story from Germany. This is from Agence France Presse. Sophie Scholl, the German resistance figure executed by the Nazis, who was born 100 years ago on Sunday, has become an emblem of courage and a national hero for many. But the legacy of the young woman sentenced to a brutal death for distributing anti-Nazi pamphlets has recently been co-opted by Germany's anti-lockdown movement, to the dismay of historians and the Jewish community. At a demonstration in April, one woman had a placard featuring a picture of Sophie Scholl draped on string around her shoulders. The real damage is done by those millions who want to survive. The honest men who just want to be left in peace, it read, words famously pronounced by the resistance campaigner. Even one of her nephews, Julian Eicher, has prominently spoken at Corona skeptic demonstrations, including on a stage decorated with white roses, evoking the name of Scholl's resistance group. In a country where right-wing extremism is seen as the #1 threat to security, migrants not a threat to security at all. And where a record number of xenophobic and anti-Semitic crimes were recorded in 2020, historians say the misappropriation of Scholl's memory is deeply alarming. Some also warn that democracy itself is being attacked at a time when living witnesses of World War II have dwindled significantly in numbers. By trivializing the Holocaust and dictatorship, these activists are endangering democracy, said Ludwig Spanle, Bavaria's anti-Semitism commissioner. Yes. As I pointed out before, neither Hitler nor Stalin would have dared to order people to remain in their homes, to be forbidden to go to parks or playgrounds or the beach, or to observe the cherry trees in blossom. But no, to make a comparison between the sanitary dictatorship and the Nazi dictatorship, that is verboten. Here's a story from CBS Boston. Andover parents Kristen and Scott are speaking out on behalf of their daughter. She, along with 2 of her friends, are freshmen at UMass Amherst. A picture posted on social media of the 3 friends not wearing masks outside was handed over to the university, and that has landed them in serious trouble. There was a photo sent to the administration of these girls outside off campus on a Saturday. This is why they lost a whole semester of their schooling. Teresa and RJ's daughter was also suspended. She was valedictorian and class president of her high school. She did everything right, RJ said. Students on campus say the rules have been tight this year, but for good reason. Maybe a little harsh, but I understand it because you're not supposed to be doing that, one student told a WBZ Friday night. The town of Amherst made it really clear they don't want any big parties, another student said. What also infuriates the parents of the suspended students was video of the UMass Amherst hockey team celebrating their national championship on campus. Some students, including some of the players, could not be seen wearing masks. I just want the university administration to be equitable and fair, RJ said. Since their suspension, the students have been studying remotely at their homes. However, last week they were cut off from virtual learning. They were not allowed to take their finals, so parents say their kids' semester was a total loss, both financially and academically. That negates this whole semester $16,000 of money, and they have to reapply for next semester, but they missed housing registration. I hope they get a refund. I hope those parents sue UMass Amherst into the ground. UMass Amherst released a statement saying students received a number of public health messages this semester that emphasized the importance of following public health protocols and the consequences for not complying, and those messages were also shared on UMass social media channels. The parents disagree with the university's decision. One little thing happens and you're out, like not even a don't do it again, here's some probation, Teresa said. So for this to happen, it's been demonstrating. Attending UMass Amherst costs $16,000 a semester? My word. And here is a story from Stephen Nelson at the New York Post. As business owners from coast to coast say they can't find enough workers willing to come back to work, President Biden on Monday said that he wants to make sure people offered a job either take it or lose the generous COVID-19 unemployment benefits. The law is clear. If you're receiving unemployment benefits and you're offered a suitable job, you can't refuse that job and just keep getting the unemployment benefits. Biden said at the White House, no one should be allowed to game the system, and we will insist that this law is followed. Biden didn't say how exactly current rules could be more strictly enforced. States administer unemployment benefits, and many are bedeviled by notoriously outdated and inefficient computer systems. Biden added, let's not take our eye off the ball. Families who are just trying to put food on the table, keep a roof over their head, they aren't the problem. Biden made the comments even as White House Press Secretary Jen, not Jennifer, but Jen Psaki, insisted that the benefits, which pay some people more not to work, were not the cause of disappointing job numbers released last week. Psaki told reporters at her daily briefing, we don't see evidence that extra unemployment insurance is a major driver in people not rejoining the workforce. Okay, and coming up, we'll go to lockdown skeptics. CPS admits that all offenses charged under the Coronavirus Act were incorrectly charged. Wow. Kind of sounds like a conspiracy theory, doesn't it? A Freedom of Information request has confirmed that 0 prosecutions have been made successfully in Britain under the Coronavirus Act. The request asked, since its inception, how many prosecutions have been made successfully? The response, given on Monday by the Crown Prosecution Service, reads as follows. Since the CPS started its review on finalized cases charged under the Coronavirus Act 2020, in April 2020 and up until February 2021, we found that all offenses charged under the Act were incorrectly charged and therefore discontinued because there was insufficient evidence to prove the offenses under the Act. There were no cases where a suspect was convicted under the Act as of February 2021. So in other words, this wasn't real law. It was simply terrorism. Boris Johnson announced his next step in reopening as daily COVID deaths in England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland fall to 0. Is 0 good enough for you, Boris, or does there have to be a negative number? Perhaps some of the people who have died of COVID will come back to life, and then maybe the lockdown will end. Ireland's Deputy Prime Minister hails Day of Freedom as restrictions are partially eased, but hotels, pubs, and restaurants will remain closed until June. Health Minister Nadine Dorries opposes mandatory vaccination for care home staff. New postcard from Back to Normal promotes ivermectin. Come on, Boris, the evidence is clear. Ivermectin prevents and cures COVID-19. It breaks the chain of infection. No vaccines or passports now needed. Fast track it and save lives. COVID Recovery Group calls on Boris to end all restrictions on June the 21st. I hate this is a reader spotted a good comment by someone styling herself Dolores on Nextdoor Co. UK. a website that hosts numerous local forums. This one was headed Neighborhood Snitches. I hate neighborhood snitches. Unbelievable. After over a year in lockdown, a family decides to have a celebration in their garden with just a few family and friends, and their neighbor opposite, not next door, opposite, decides to take a photo of them in their garden, post the photo on a neighborhood WhatsApp group, asking whether they should report them, and one of the group members informs them to contact the police. The neighbor complains that the family are disturbing them. The police show up and stop the celebration. This is on a beautiful Sunday evening between 6 to 7 p.m. The disturbed neighbor had their window open whilst taking the photo. How disturbed were they really? This is the caliber of neighbor living on a redacted road. You know who you are. I hate neighborhood snitches, and the police need to find better ways of spending their time. The reader replied to this person in the forum, magnificent comment, Dolores. Do please one day go to the war tunnels in Jersey if you've yet to do so. The tunnels built by the Germans now house a museum about Jersey's wartime occupation. There is one exhibit which is impossible to forget, a small, rather crumpled piece of paper on which in fake pencil are written two names, those of a father and son who listened to a radio, banned of course. The note was written by a neighbor informing the Germans father and son were shot. The electorate didn't endorse the lockdown policy last week. They just plumped for the least terrible of the pro-lockdown parties. UK's COVID alert level should be lowered to DEFCON 3, say chief medical officers. Lack of attention to airborne transmission led to blunders in pandemic management. And let's go to Alex Berenson's website. Okay, here we are. He says, and yeah, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but I am an anti-masker. They are a distraction, a nuisance, dirty, a waste of money, and frustrating to some people with disabilities. They have been mandated primarily to scare people into believing we remain in a state of emergency. All this might maybe be justifiable if they worked, but we have no evidence that they do, not on the micron level, not on the national level, and not in between. Tell me about all the hairdressers you like. The only decent randomized clinical trial failed. Berenson tweets, hearing more cases of ugly vaccine side effects, not from readers, but from secondhand folks I know. I sense those type of stories are driving the decline in shots more than anything else. Why did vaccine advocates make the mistake of assuming word of mouth would be positive? Too long, didn't read. In the Pfizer teen COVID vaccine trial, 4 or 5, the exact figure is hidden, of 1,100 kids who got the vaccine had serious side effects compared to 1 who got a placebo. The Food and Drug Administration did not disclose specifics, so we have no idea what they were or if they follow any pattern. The FDA says there's no pattern. Of course, the FDA also said the CVST case in the Johnson & Johnson clinical trial wasn't related to that vaccine, so, you know, everybody makes mistakes. Could it be more obvious that the teen authorization is a panicked move in response to the collapsing demand? The Johnson & Johnson pause worsened. Could it be more obvious it will backfire? A tweet from Laura Litvan, FDA authorizes Pfizer-BioNTech COVID vaccine for ages 12 to 15. Berenson says, wow, they did this with no public briefing book or detailed safety data. Yes, but they are safe and efficacious. And we know this must be true because that's what the experts tell us. Before I return to Hilar Bellox, the Serval state, I'm going to take another look at the chat. Let's see. Did you wear your mask at the pool? LOL, says Jay Miller. Responding to Gamion, who said, just opened the pool season, feels so good. Geez, he stole Seinfeld. Oh, Dolores. Yes, that's one of the bingo squares for me. Seinfeld joke. The amount of working perfect condition T-34 tanks amazes me. I do not see us forces marching with that sort of discipline, says Chogoken 666. Okay. Let's see. Doc said, cough is definitely from acid reflux and gave me an RX, says Chogoken 666. If anyone's going to game the system, it'll be the big guy, says Dan. Steve, I suppose this was said with a Russian accent. You have virus? No problem. Drink vodka. Feel better. Texas Feral Hog says obesity, drug addiction, alcoholism, mental illness. No wonder I get the feeling doctors don't like me. Quachalango says, acquaintance of mine was roommate of Black Francis there. That would be at UMass. Black Francis from the Pixies, of course. And okay, so let's go to Hilaire Belloc talking about the collapse of the distributive state in England. He writes, consider in what way the industrial system developed upon capitalist lines. Why were a few rich men put with such ease into possession of the new methods? Why was it normal and natural in their eyes and in that of contemporary society that those who produced the new wealth with the new machinery should be proletarian and dispossessed? Simply because the England upon which the new discoveries had come was already an England owned as to its soil and accumulations of wealth by a small minority. It was already an England in which perhaps half of the whole population was proletarian and a medium for exploitation ready to hand. When any one of the new industries was launched, it had to be capitalized, that is, accumulated wealth from some source or other had to be found, which would support labor in the process of production until that process should be complete. Someone must find the corn and the meat and the housing and the clothing by which it should be supported, because the extraction of the raw material and the moment when the consumption of the finished article could begin, the human agents which dealt with that raw material and turned it into the finished product. Had property been well distributed, protected by cooperative guilds, fenced round and supported by custom and by the autonomy of great artisan corporations, those accumulations of wealth necessary for the launching of each new method of production and for each new perfection of it would have been discovered in the mass of small owners. Their corporations, their little parcels of wealth, combined would have furnished the capitalization required for the new processes, and men already owners would, as one invention succeeded another, have increased the total wealth of the community without disturbing the balance of distribution. There is no conceivable link in reason or in experience which binds the capitalization of a new process with the idea of a few employing owners and a mass of employed non-owners working at a wage. Such great discoveries coming in a society like that of the 13th century would have blessed and enriched mankind. Coming upon the diseased moral conditions of the 18th century in this country, England, they proved a curse. To whom could the new industry turn for capitalization? The small owner had already largely disappeared. The corporate life and mutual obligations which had supported him and confirmed him in his property had been broken to pieces by no economic development, but by the deliberate action of the rich. He was ignorant because his schools had been taken from him and the universities closed to him. He was the more ignorant because the common life, which once nourished his social sense, and the cooperative arrangements which had once been his defense, had disappeared. When you sought an accumulation of corn, of clothing, of housing, of fuel, as the indispensable preliminary to the launching of your new industry, when you looked round for someone who could find the accumulated wealth necessary for these considerable experiments, you had to turn to the class which had already monopolized the bulk of the means of production in England. The rich men alone could furnish you with those supplies. Nor was this all. The supplies once found and the adventure capitalized that form of human energy which lay best to hand, which was indefinitely exploitable, weak, ignorant, and desperately necessitous, ready to produce for you upon almost any terms, and glad enough if you would only keep it alive, was the existing proletariat which the new plutocracy had created, when, in cornering the wealth of the country after the Reformation, they had thrust out the mass of Englishmen from the possession of implements, of houses, and of land. The rich class, adopting some new process of production for its private gain, worked it upon those lines of mere competition which its avarice had already established. Cooperative tradition was dead. Where would it find its cheapest labor? Obviously among the proletariat, not among the remaining small owners. What class would increase under the new wealth? Obviously the proletariat again, without responsibilities, with nothing to leave to its progeny. As they swelled the capitalist gain, they enabled him with increasing power to buy out the small owner and send him to swell by another tributary, the proletarian mass. It was upon this account that the Industrial Revolution, as it is called, took in its very origins the form which has made it an almost unmixed curse for the unhappy society in which it has flourished. The rich, already possessed of the accumulations by which that industrial change could alone be nourished, inherited all its succeeding accumulations of implements and all its increasing accumulations of subsistence. The factory system, starting upon a basis of capitalist and proletariat, grew in the mold which had determined its origins. With every new advance, the capitalists looked for proletariat grist to feed the productive mill. Every circumstance of that society, the form in which the laws that governed ownership and profit were cast, the obligations of partners, the relations between master and man, directly made for the indefinite expansion of a subject, formless, wage-earning class controlled by a small body of owners, which body would tend to become smaller and richer still, and to be possessed of power over greater and greater as the bad business unfolded. The spread of economic oligarchy was everywhere and not just in industry alone. The great landlords destroyed deliberately and of set purpose and to their own advantage the common rights over common land. The small plutocracy with which they were knit up and with whose mercantile elements they were now fused directed everything to its own ends. That strong central government, which should protect the community against the rapacity of a few, had gone generations before. Capitalism triumphant wielded all the mechanism of legislation and of information too. It still holds them. And there is not an example of so-called social reform today which is not demonstrably, though often subconsciously, directed to the further entrenchment and confirmation of an industrial society in which it is taken for granted that a few shall own, that the vast majority shall live at a wage under them, and that all the bulk of Englishmen may hope for is the amelioration of their lot by regulations and by control from above, but not by property, not by freedom. We all feel, and those a few of us who have analyzed the matter not only feel but know, that the capitalist society thus gradually developed from its origins in the capture of the land 400 years ago has reached its term. It is almost self-evident that it cannot continue in the form which now 3 generations have known, and it is equally self-evident that some solution must be found for the intolerable and increasing instability with which it has poisoned our lives. But before considering the solutions variously presented by various schools of thought, I shall, in my next section, show how and why the English capitalist industrial system is thus intolerably unstable and consequently presents an acute problem which must be solved under pain of social death. And tomorrow I will begin with section 5 of the Servile State, the capitalist state in proportion as it grows. Perfect grows unstable. I was thinking today about a British psychologist whose name is Sir Simon Baron-Cohen. Yes, he's the first cousin of the comedian. And his idea of autism being extreme male brain, that there are 2 sides to man. There is the empathizing and systemizing. And Baron-Cohen posits that autism, you see it in people who are relentless systemizers. This came to mind when I came across an article on mercatornet.com, Navigating Modern Complexities. When all the nerds died, all the trans people appeared. Coincidence? An American mother mourns the loss of her nerdy teenager in the transgender tsunami. Now, this article's got a lot of attention, and some people think that it is a hoax. But I will continue on. The anonymous author writes, do you know why it matters whether you use a 1.85 to 1 aspect ratio or a 2.39 to 1 aspect ratio? I don't, because I refuse to learn. This is a long-running discussion in my marriage. My husband seems very insistent that the distinction between the two is critical. The more he insists, the less I care, and neither of us is backing down. My husband is the definition of a nerd. Nerds will die on the hill of aspect ratios, even if it means clearing the room. We all know a nerd. We all know when we need them and when we want to avoid them. They're handy with fixing the Ethernet connection, not so much with jazzing up the conversation at a work party. Married to a nerd, you'll know. Even your sister knows the pros and cons of 1.85 to 1 and 2.39 to 1 by now. Your friends ask who's going to come to your dinner party. Subtext, please, please, God, not the husband's friends. The husband I can cope with, but the husband and his friends are too much. In my son's early years, I hoped I might have passed on some natural indifference towards aspect ratios. Maybe I would have an ally who cared as little as I did, or even less. But no, by the time he was a toddler, he was shaping up to be a regular clone of my husband. When the leader of the Mommy and Me class asked the kids to throw out a word for everyone to repeat, my son didn't say bear or rabbit. He said the war in Afghanistan. Obviously, my husband's room-clearing ability was genetic. I dropped my dear child off at the elementary school and watched the other kids run away to avoid being trapped in an intensely detailed conversation about the latest thing he picked up on. But nobody calls kids nerds these days. It's a word you hear less and less. In fact, nearly a decade and a half later, my now teenage son sits in classrooms full of kids who probably say nerd as much as they say square or loser. As a category, nerd seems to be disappearing. Are its members, once proudly split between Star Trek and Star Wars clans, being absorbed into the general population? Is there a new word I just don't know? Or are they disappearing completely? Are we witnessing nerd-ocide? I would say that the big change in nerd population is that nerds used to be smart. People might have hated them, but it was understood that they were highly intelligent. Now, being a nerd seems to be associated with the consumption of popular culture, not just Star Trek, Star Wars, Harry Potter, and all that sort of thing. Apparently, you don't need to be smart to be a nerd anymore. You just need to be a bore. But back to the article. I don't think it's only the nerds. The same thing has happened to tomboys, too. Maybe I'm showing my age, but where are all the girls who dirt bike? All the teenage girls I see these days look the same. Where are the girls in oil-stained overalls talking about engine parts? And then there's lesbians. A recent Gallup poll gives us some nerdy stats on this. The number of lesbians went up all the way through the 1980s, the 1990s, the 2000s, but then it hit the downslope. When I first saw this, it really didn't make sense. We're all getting more tolerant nowadays, right? So why the shift? I know that lesbians aren't all tomboys or vice versa, but it looks like they're both heading in the same direction, south. I couldn't help thinking it's the same thing that's happening to the nerds. But alphabet people identification overall is going up, way up. It's not that there are more gay guys, it's that there are more trans people, as well as categories we didn't even have until recently, like non-binary. There are even people who say they're queer and straight, which really does make me feel old. So are these new alphabet people, even the straight queers, actually just the nerds and tomboys from back in the day? It feels like the two things at least might be linked. To me, this fits. All these kiddos are obsessed with bodies. I love a good selfie, but these young people really take it to the max. All they think about is how they look. I hate that the young are blamed for this, as if my generation would do oh so much better in the world of Pornhub and Snapchat filters. But it's not just a vain fixation with appearance. Nerds have nowhere to go. Nerds used to have transferable skills. One nerd was better at programming, the other at art. These skills were a sort of currency. Once they were free of the school's grip, men like my husband went out into the world to nerd it up. They went from being the target of wedgies to the target of acquisition bids. The nerds in my son's generation don't seem proud of their skills because they're not visible. So going back to my son, this kid had obsessive craze after obsessive craze. Thomas the Tank Engine was his universe. He knew where that train ate, slept, and played, him and all the other trains in the station. Trust me, I heard all about it. But then he got to know so much about Thomas that he hit peak Thomas and suddenly lost all interest. So then it was roller coasters. He knew everything about them, where the biggest was, the tallest was, the fastest was. I could have used Thomas and his friends as doorstops, and he wouldn't even have noticed. He was an expert on roller coasters. He wrote a song about roller coasters. He wanted to be a roller coaster designer. He built roller coasters. He drew roller coasters, a lot of them. We'd watch videos of roller coasters. This lasted until about the age of 8, when I'd finally got my head around roller coasters, and then it was suddenly Minecraft, and he was an expert in that instead. Here's the important point. Nerd is a genetic trait. My mother-in-law warned me about this on the day of my wedding. Would my husband even notice that you can read the print on his t-shirt underneath his white tuxedo shirt? No, because it wasn't about aspect ratios. So we got him changed into a plain t-shirt. But then he put on a bright red watch, which he thought was just fine because it wasn't about aspect ratio. She told me, if it's not technical, he's just not interested. Like father, like son, I learned. My son was all or nothing. And one day he dug through every little fact to become the world's expert. He moved on to the next thing. One day I guessed he'd find his own aspect ratio. But the next thing didn't make any sense. He suddenly decided he was trans, even though he'd never shown any sign of femininity at all. In fact, the opposite. It's not as though I thought that this was exactly like the roller coasters or Minecraft. He was coming into puberty and trying to make sense of his place in the world and his new feelings about girls. It was important to him. But I also knew my kid and knew that as soon as he was interested in something, he'd throw himself into it 100%. So I guess the best thing to do was to let him figure it out in his own time. But just like his father's inability to move on to the next topic, my son was suddenly unable to stop talking about transition. But if it didn't make sense to me because he wasn't thinking about what came after transition. Usually he'd know every single aspect of what something entailed from start to finish, but with his sudden obsession with transition, he wasn't able to research what kind of body he'd have afterwards. It was such a weird gap, and it made it difficult to take the whole thing seriously. Why did he care so much about the process of transition, but not its result? I kept on coming back to this point over and over. My son seemed to be glitching. He was stuck on repeat. Normally, he'd be doing everything he could to get all the details, so no one was as expert as he was. But he didn't want to be an expert in transgenderism in the same way that he wanted to be an expert in roller coasters or Minecraft. He couldn't bring himself to look at the consequences of the changes he said he wanted to make to his body. It was a blind spot. He knew all about transition, but nothing about the people who transitioned and didn't want to find out either. The people I told about this seem to think he won't change his mind, but I know his mind. I know how he thinks and how his big obsessions suddenly resolve themselves away. And I can't help but wonder how this connects to gaming. Just before he got obsessed with transition, he was always playing video games, which gave him avatars he could customize, where he could be this or that boy or girl. Is that what he thought he was doing to his body? Didn't he realize his body didn't come with a reset button? I was already skeptical about medication, this woman writes. My husband was even told by his doctor that his cholesterol was too high, and he got prescribed statins to bring it down. But my husband hated the idea of being on medication for life, so he decided to deal with it by exercise and diet. He cut down on sugar and dairy, went jogging once, and even that made enough of a difference to bring the number down. It made me wonder just how much money these big corporations are raking in from medications that aren't just researched enough. So when I looked at all these drugs my kid wanted to take as part of his transition, I genuinely got nauseous. I already knew about Lupron because a friend of mine took a few doses of it for IVF. Now she has a lifelong heart problem requiring constant monitoring and medication. Apparently 1 to 10% of people who take puberty blockers like Lupron get heart problems, but heart disease runs in our family on both sides. My son is way more likely to be in that 1 to 10%. And she concludes, are we medicating the nerds away? Are we convincing them that their bodies are just like avatars they can try on or get rid of once they get bored? After all, if he goes through this, it might not just be hormones. It might be surgery too. I genuinely don't think my son gets how permanent that is. I know it sounds crazy, but I really don't. And what's wrong with just being a nerd? It was good enough for Bill Gates, Charles Darwin, Steve Jobs, Mozart, and Albert Einstein. I always wanted a nerd. Nerds are smart. They earn good money. They're safe, or at least they used to be. I wish my son would stop talking about gender and start living. It's making him boring. And if I want to be bored, I can talk to my husband about aspect ratios. So we look at the chat. Only in the USA is nerd an insult, says Gamayan. Quachilango says geeks killed nerds. I think this is true. I think this is true. Alex Delarge says, I probably have at least mild Asperger's. Yes, Elon Musk hosted Saturday Night Live, and he said his monologue was pretty good. He said he was the first SNL host to have Asperger's, or at least to admit to it. Don Willis quotes Timothy McVeigh. I've come to peace with myself, my God, and my cause. Yeah, okay, I don't know whether I want to repeat the rest of that. Do you know that part of the government indictment against Timothy McVeigh was that when he was arrested, there were tracts. He had tracts by Thomas Jefferson. How about that? Huh? How about that? Thomas Jefferson was a radical man, no question. Thomas Jefferson once wrote, he was such a proponent of the French Revolution that he said that even if mankind were reduced to two people, to Adam and Eve, that would be better than the French Revolution failing. Yes, quite a radical. Okay, what are we going to talk about now? Oh, yeah, I wanted to mention this story from the New York Times, is it? Yes. It's called The Separate Worlds of Bill and Melinda Gates. Bill Gates and Melinda French Gates were stuck at home. I've been reading about Bill Gates' wife for decades, and I have never heard her referred to as Melinda French Gates before. But apparently that's what it is now. And so it's talking about, this article talks about the future of Ms. French Gates. Apparently both her and her husband are hands-on leaders, and much of the power of their foundation lies not just in the billions of dollars they've given it, but in their public standing and connections. What exactly did Melinda Gates bring to the table? This is another example of a person who is worshipped essentially for having married the boss, just like Michelle Obama. She worked at Microsoft. She was not a coder. She was not known for being particularly successful at Microsoft. And then she married the boss and became very rich. And now she gallivants around the world telling us all what we are doing wrong. Peter Hitchens, in his column in the Mail on Sunday, writes, I'm still seething about the official attitude towards the deranged jaunty bravery who, after a long career of crazed violence, well known to officialdom, hurled a child from the top of the Tate Modern. The public were left entirely unprotected from this person. It could have been you whose life he wrecked without a second's warning. None of us would know if someone similar to him was at large now in our own hometowns, though officials would. The crime makes no possible sense, nor did bravery's many previous recorded actions bloody, cruel, and pointless. Alas, an increasing number of senseless crimes of this type are committed in this country all the time. Some are wrongly classified as terrorism. Others are just recorded and vaguely dealt with without anyone trying to make sense of them. But what really infuriated me, Hitchens writes, when I looked into the bravery case, was that it was quite impossible to discover why he might be so crazy or how he became crazy, and so it is also impossible to prevent it from happening again. I get this again and again from police forces uninterested in drug use by violent offenders. But this time we had a published report clearly stating that a dangerous person at large in a busy capital city had a long record of wild violence. It also stated he was taking an unnamed medication. Two questions arose. How had he become unhinged in the first place? Individual madness is quite rare, but it's a sad fact that a growing number of children are introduced to marijuana at younger and younger ages and become permanently mentally ill as a result. Irish psychiatrists last week reported that marijuana is the gravest threat to the mental health of young people in that country. The College of Psychiatrists of Ireland said that a combination of ever stronger strains of the drug and a common public belief that it is harmless, the same idiocy as widespread here, has had devastating effects. All say. Hardly a day goes by without my friend Ross Granger adding another hideous case of violence committed by supposedly peaceful dope smokers to his Attacker Smoked Cannabis website. It is an even sadder fact, well known in the US but largely ignored here, that legal mind-altering drugs are also associated with acts of severe violence, including school shootings and similar massacres. But thanks to dim-witted legalization campaigns by empty-headed fools such as Sir Richard Branson, the authorities are now so uninterested in marijuana that its possession is no longer prosecuted, and so official records of its use are disappearing. And attempts to look into the mental state of people such as bravery are met with a blank refusal to reveal the facts on the pretext of medical confidentiality. Surely, once you have thrown a child off a high building, you have forfeited medical confidentiality. Does nobody in this country have a sense of proportion anymore? And then he has an item about e-bikes or e-scooters, which I have noticed started appearing in Victoria. You know, it was already dangerous enough being a pedestrian, as I am, with people who ride bicycles at high speeds along the sidewalks, skateboarders, and people with their mobility scooters. But now we are embracing another menace to pedestrians. He notes the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Angela Rayner, is posted having wearing leopard skin print yoga pants, and she's on an e-scooter. Hitchens concludes, I only began writing about this when it was clear nobody else would, but I'm baffled there is so little opposition. There will be plenty once it is too late to do anything about it. Now is the time to object. Perhaps Angela Rayner could do some research. I can't see how e-scooters will make the lives of her supporters any better. So it's Monday, which means Music Monday. And today I'm talking about a fellow called Pink Floyd. Pink Floyd was the founder or lead of a band called, Syd Barrett was the founder of a band called Pink Floyd, of who you've all heard of. One of the best-selling acts in history. They've sold hundreds of millions of records. Dark Side of the Moon still continues to sell hundreds of thousands of copies every year. Syd Barrett was their leader through their first album and their first three singles. And then he went mad. He became impossible to work with. I'll tell you a story about this. That one day he said to the band that he had a new song, and it was called Have You Got It Yet? So he showed them the chords, and the rest of the band started playing along with him. Every time he got to the chorus, he would change the chords so the band couldn't follow him, and he would shout, Have you got it yet? And this went on for the longest time before they got it. It was decided in 1967 that Syd's old friend, David Gilmour, was going to be brought in as a second guitarist because Syd simply, he had a habit of just stopping playing when he was on stage, or just playing the same chord over and over and over again. But there was an idea that, maybe he could be a Brian Wilson type, still contributing behind the scenes. Well, it didn't work very well for the Beach Boys, and it didn't work very well for Pink Floyd. So one day they were going to a concert, and someone asked, it's undetermined who this person was, should we pick up Syd? And someone else said, no, let's not bother. And so he was gone from the band that he had founded, that he was the lead guitarist of, the singer, and he wrote most of their songs. And Syd became a very, very strange person indeed. There's a terrifying story told about him, which is apparently true, But about a year after he was kicked out of the band, he showed up at a Pink Floyd concert and went up to his old friend David Gilmour and said, "Hi, Dave, it's me, Sid. Remember? I used to be in your band." And apparently he was completely sincere. He was seen in the studio when Sid Barrett, when Pink Floyd was recording an album, and he had shaved off all his hair, including his eyebrows, and he had become tremendously fat, and such that he was sitting in a corner of the studio and no one paid attention to him. And when Roger Waters finally noticed who it was, he couldn't stop himself from weeping. And of course, Pink Floyd later did the albums. They wrote essentially 2 albums about Sid Barrett. Roger Waters said, I read this for years and years, that Roger Waters said that the biggest literary influence on Sid Barrett was Hilaire Belloc. And I thought, that doesn't sound likely. But it turns out that it's true. That Pink Floyd had originally done a song which was one of Belloc's poems for children. And unfortunately, they couldn't get the rights from Belloc's estate. The song is called Matilda Mother, which is on the Piper at the Gates of Dawn, which of course takes its name from Kenneth Grahame's classic "The Wind in the Willows." Piper at the Gates of Dawn is a psychedelic record, but it's a really odd record because it is so childlike. Songs like Matilda Mother and Lucifer Sam, which is about a cat, the gnome, chapter 24, the scarecrow. They are, as I say, that they're very childlike, which is not the sort of thing I suppose that one would associate with psychedelic music. But of course, Pink Floyd were in many ways progenitor of what we now believe to be psychedelic. So Dave Gilmour and Roger Waters, I guess they felt bad about Sid being kicked out of the band, and they were determined to help him the best they could. And the result was a record that came out in April 1968 called "The Madcap Laughs." And it was originally produced by Malcolm Jones, who worked for EMI, and he got taken off the project. And the manager, Pink Floyd's manager, Peter Jenner, decided to bet on Sid rather than Pink Floyd, which was a bad bet. He was involved in production, and then David Gilmour and Roger Waters got involved. And this is one of the strangest records ever made. Sid, he played the guitar and he sang, but he never did the same thing twice. And it was absolutely infuriating trying to get recordings out of him. And he could never keep up the same tempo of the song. He was always slowing down and speeding up. So everyone had to, follow him. And Willie Wilson, who was long associated with David Gilmour, got involved, and Robert Wyatt, Soft Machine, Hugh Hopper of Soft Machine, and Mike Ratledge of Soft Machine were involved. But it's mostly Sid and David Gilmour. I suppose Gilmour has been accused of cruelty because of this record, of taking advantage of the mentally ill. The songs are odd, even odder than the songs that Sid had made at Pink Floyd. And Gilmour included a lot of studio chatter in the recording, such that you can hear him starting and stopping, saying, "No, I'm going to try again." And I suppose, it's cinema verite. It's a very anguished production. But it really is a remarkable work. I mean, it really deserves the word singular. It didn't sell very many records, but EMI was still interested in Syd Barrett. And in 1970, early 1970, a second record appeared called Barrett, with a lovely cover of Bees, which was done by Syd himself. And a lot of the people from the first album were involved. But again, it's Syd and David. Richard Wright, the keyboardist of Pink Floyd, took a big part in it. And Jerry Shirley, the drummer for Humble Pie. And it is strange. Again, Syd wasn't getting any more sane. I suppose the highlight of the album might be a song he'd written when he was a child. It's a nursery rhyme called Effervescing Elephant. I guess in the same way that the highlight of the first album might have been Golden Hair, which is a James Joyce poem that Barrett set to music. So the Barrett album did not sell very much at all, and EMI dropped him. And he was involved in a band called Stars, which played, I don't know, concert or two, and then nothing. Syd went back to Cambridge, where he came from, like the rest of the band, and he lived with his mother. And it wasn't very long before Syd had become a cult figure. Amongst musos, there was a obsession with Syd Barrett. Where is Syd Barrett? What is he doing now? And in 1974, in the wake of the success of Dark Side of the Moon, Harvest, EMI, put out a twofer called Syd Barrett, which included both of his albums. And that's where I first learned of Syd Barrett. In a very beautiful package with many pictures of Syd, who was a very photogenic person. And this album actually charted in the United States. Such was the obsession with Pink Floyd at the time. If you look at Syd Barrett's career, he had some single hits, See Emily Play and Arnold Lane in the 1960s. And he wrote almost all the songs on the first Pink Floyd album, and he wrote one song on the second Pink Floyd album. There was some songs which have finally been released that Syd recorded with Pink Floyd in the old days, which the band refused to release for decades because they're so harrowing. Songs like Vegetable Man. When Syd Barrett died in 2006, at the age of 60, I found out that he was making about £150,000 a year from his recordings. Now, as I say, he never really had any hits. Not in the 1970s when records started to sell in large numbers, but there were songs that he had written with Pink Floyd, which appeared on Pink Floyd live albums and on various Pink Floyd compilations. And it's a testament to how much money you can make in the music business when people aren't stealing it from you. David Gilmour made sure that Syd got his money. And there had been attempts to flush Syd Barrett out. He lived in Cambridge, and he painted, and he considered himself to be a visual artist. He was unrecognizable from what he had been, but some people found out where he was living, and they made a nuisance of themselves. I really don't understand this. I mean, it's showing up on someone's doorstep, you know. You've been hiding from the public for decades, but I'm a big fan, so I guess you're going to want to talk to me. Sid was an influence on a great many artists. David Bowie was certainly one. On his Pinups album, he covered See Emily Play. One of the reasons for David Bowie's admiration of Syd Barrett is that Barrett sang in an English accent at a time when British singers tended to adopt an American or mid-Atlantic accent. For some reason, singing with one's natural voice was something that wasn't done. So there have been numerous compilations of Syd's work. Essentially, the same sessions. Oh, here's a different take. Here's a different take again. And there was a song that Syd did very early on called "Talking Bob Dylan Blues," which is a satire, a parody of the folk singer craze, which was highly coveted by collectors. And it finally made its appearance on a compilation a few years ago. But as I say, it's the same songs over and over again. The Best of Syd Barrett, this compilation that came out in 2001, which is quite good, and it includes Bob Dylan Blues. And there is an introduction to Syd Barrett, which came out in 2010, which has a bonus track called Ramadan, which is it's a drone that lasts about 20 minutes. And this was highly anticipated by collectors as well. It's really not worth hearing. I suppose the advantage of an introduction to Syd Barrett is that it includes songs that he had written for Pink Floyd. But essentially, I mean, there are three essential Syd Barrett recordings. That's the first Pink Floyd record, Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and his two solo records. Now, of course, the record industry famously keeps squeezing stale oranges, looking for more juice. But I think that we have seen the last of Syd Barrett compilations. There's no more juice to be squeezed from that orange. I mentioned David Bowie. He was a surprise guest at a David Gilmour solo concert where he sang Arnold Lane. And you can find the recording on YouTube. It's really beautiful to watch because, David Bowie had essentially retired from the music business and he had nothing to prove. And he was just doing a favor for an old friend, David Gilmour. And you can see how much he is enjoying himself in the process. Don Willis says, I'm going to buy KMG a new mouse. Okay, I don't use a mouse. I use a trackball. Quachalango says, Jesus and Mary Chain Vegetable Man cover was a sign of a new sound, mid-'80s. Indeed, it was. Jim Smith says, way back when I bought copies of Madcap Laughs and Barrett, I love early Pink Floyd, but these albums were unlistenable, and I eventually sold them. Someone complaining about a scraping sound? I suppose it could be my chair. Okay. What else do we have here? I'd like to hear all of the Barrett era stuff. I know it's cool to like that more than the later, but all the Water stuff is on the radio all the time. When Syd Barrett was kicked out of the band, it was the general consensus that Pink Floyd were finished because they didn't have, a writer in the band. But they all stepped up. First David Gilmour, and then Roger Waters, who of course took over the band, became the dictator and started firing all the other members. He eventually left, and believed that Pink Floyd was over. And David Gilmour said, no, it's not over. And a very long and costly court battle ensued. So let's talk about what's coming up on the show later. On Theater Thursday, I'm going to be talking about a Japanese horror movie from 1977 called House. On May the 20th, The Friends of Eddie Coyle, starring Robert Mitchum, directed by Peter Yates from 1973. In May 27, Carol Reed's The Fallen Idol. On June the 3rd, Fred Zinnemann's film about St. Thomas More, A Man for All Seasons. And on June the 10th, the documentary Hitchcock with Truffaut, which is really a gloss. It's an 80-minute gloss on the famous book that Truffaut wrote based on his lengthy interviews with Alfred Hitchcock. It's a really remarkable book because it's a discussion of how movies are actually made by one of the greatest filmmakers of all time. On the book club on Friday, I'm going to be talking about Cultured Grugs by John Chapman. On May 21st, The Lullaby of Polish Girls, a novel by the actress Dagmara Dominczyk. On May the 28th, Russia's American Pilgrim. And on June the 4th, a dystopian novel, Immortal Life by Stanley Bing. And on Music Monday, next Monday, I'm going to be talking about the Glenn Gould cult. Of course, if you've ever been to Toronto, there's a famous statue of him sitting on a bench, and as many people have pointed out, looking very much like a sex pest. But Gould famously left the concert stage, I believe, in 1964, and decided that he was simply going to make records. I adored Glenn Gould when I was younger, but I can't stand him now because the violence that he did to Mozart, Beethoven, Brahms, etc. He really didn't want to make those records. He insisted that Orlando Gibbons was his favorite composer, and one has to ask, as always with Glenn Gould, whether he was taking the mickey. But there you have it. I will be back on the air tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. And if you like the show or any part of it, I'd appreciate it if you click on the like button and subscribe to my YouTube channel if you have not already done so. If you'd like to make a donation to this live stream, very much appreciated, especially in my present circumstances. My PayPal account is linked to Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. Once again, Kevin_Grace at hotmail.com. If you are in Canada, a donation can be made to my live stream directly at kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these times of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.